Episode 56, The Air Stewardess. It had been a long business trip for Edward, and he was looking forward to go back home to his family. It was already midnight as he sat at the waiting area to board his plane. He was so exhausted that all he wanted to do was to get in the plane and sleep throughout the 7-hour flight back home. Little did he know that this flight would be unlike any other that would keep him thinking about the haunting he experienced that fateful night. So it was finally time for Edward to board the plane. Once he was in, he settled down, and soon after the plane took off. Right when the seatbelt signs were finally off, Edward decided to go to the washroom first before going to sleep for the night. Edward got up and walked to the washroom. As he was walking along the narrow walkway, he saw a lady entering the washroom. Edward was sure that it was one of the air stewardesses, as she had a name tag on her chest, had the typical perfectly bunned hair, and wore a familiar stewardess uniform from the past. That was the problem. Edward's curiosity grew, seeing how that particular air stewardess wore a uniform unlike the rest of her colleagues. She wore a silky traditional dress, while her colleagues were all in the formal modern suit dress. Edward arrived at the washroom and waited for the stewardess to exit before he could enter. He just stood there thinking about the uniform. He wanted to see the uniform again so that he could confirm what he had seen earlier. He was curious. He thought to himself that once the air stewardess exits the washroom, he was going to ask about her traditional uniform. So Edward just waited for almost 5 minutes before eventually another air stewardess tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Hi, sir. Are you waiting to use the washroom?" Edward was snapped out of his thoughts and replied, "Oh, yes, miss. I think your colleague is inside. It's been quite a while, though." The air stewardess looked confused and walked towards the washroom door and pushed it open. She then said, "Here you go, sir. There's no one inside. You can use it." Edward was taken aback, as all this while he thought that there was someone inside. Edward said, "Oh, that's really odd. I swear when I was walking towards here, I saw your colleague enter." "Oh, maybe you saw my colleague seemingly walking towards the washroom, but maybe she walked towards the kitchen at the back instead, sir," explained the air stewardess. Edward scratched his head and said, "Yeah, maybe you're right. I'm so tired from my trip that I might have been seeing things." Edward used the toilet, and once done, he went back to his seat near the aisle. As he saw that it would take quite a while before the food was going to be served, he decided to have a quick nap first. But as he was about to close his eyes, he saw what he thought was the air stewardess with the traditional uniform from earlier. The air stewardess walked right past him, from the back towards the front. The air stewardess seemed to be in a rush, so he couldn't see her face. Edward needed to confirm what he had seen. So he stuck out his head and saw the air stewardess walking away. But this time, Edward was sure. The air stewardess was wearing the same traditional costume that he had seen earlier. So, now Edward knew that the attire was real. But Edward was still curious. He wanted to know why the costume was different. So he waited for the air stewardess with the traditional costume to walk by him again. But after waiting for 15 minutes, he never saw the air stewardess again. Running out of patience, as he usually does, Edward decided to ask another air stewardess who was wearing the modern uniform that happened to walk past. Edward then said, "Hey, miss, sorry, a quick question." The air stewardess stopped in her tracks as she was heading to the back and said, "Yeah, sure, sir. How can I help you?" "Okay, I saw one of your colleagues wearing the traditional uniform. May I know why is hers different?" asked Edward. The air stewardess looked confused and replied, "I'm sorry, sir. Which uniform do you mean? All of us wear the same suit dress uniform that you see around." "The traditional one, the silky one." I think I've seen it in the past, too, but I haven't seen it in quite a while, though, said Edward. The air stewardess smiled and said, Yes, sir, you're right. We have phased out that uniform for over 20 years, way before I worked here. Okay, I'm sure I saw the uniform. Twice, in fact. Oh, well, maybe I was seeing things. Who knows? Said Edward. Edward thanked the air stewardess as she continued preparing the food for the passengers. Edward knew that he had seen the attire. He knew that there was no way that it was one of the passengers either. No passenger would wear the attire unless they were working. Edward decided to forget about it, as it wasn't anything important, even though he was still burning with curiosity. The passengers eventually had their meals and slowly headed to the bed after the lights were turned dim. The flight was now quiet, and barely any movements from the passengers and the staff members. Edward, too, was about to close his eyes when he suddenly saw the air stewardess in the traditional uniform walk from the front and pass right by him again. Edward was startled. He peeked out towards the aisle and turned his head. He saw the air stewardess walking towards the washroom again. He knew that he needed to find out. Edward quickly got up and followed suit. The air stewardess was still walking, and Edward sped up to catch up to her. Right when he was nearing the air stewardess, she was right next to the washroom. She stopped walking and froze. She still had her back against Edward. Stunned at the sudden stop, Edward, too, somehow stopped in his tracks. Edward now felt that something was wrong. Something really didn't feel right. To his sides, the passengers were all asleep. Right at the back, he could partially see, too, that the staff members were asleep. For the first time during the flight, things felt eerie. Edward, however, was still very curious, so he took slow steps towards the air stewardess. Not wanting to wake everyone else up, Edward just whispered and said, "Hey, miss." There was no response, nor was there any movements. The air stewardess just stood there. Now feeling even more nervous, Edward whispered out again and said, "Psst, hey, miss." Again there was no response. Edward took a couple more steps, slowly, towards the air stewardess, and now he was right behind her. Edward tapped her on the shoulder. It felt cold, but finally there was response. Without turning around, the air stewardess said, "Thank you for noticing me. I have been working here for more than 50 years, but no one seemed to notice me." Edward was at a loss for words. He still wasn't sure whether the lady was some insane passenger who dressed herself up as an air stewardess from the past, or was Edward just dreaming all this while? Edward was still staring towards the mysterious lady when she suddenly turned. Her face was red, but not as though someone had a sunburn. The redness looked like her skin had all been peeled out, as though someone who had their face stuck into a pit of fire. Seeing this, Edward was shocked and stumbled backwards a few steps before falling down. He knew right then that the lady that he had seen all along during the flight was no human. Edward had no strength to get up somehow. As he laid on the floor, all he could see was the ceiling, as thoughts about seeing the lady earlier flashed by him. Suddenly, he heard footsteps hastily walking towards him. A face suddenly appeared in his view. It was the actual air stewardess from earlier. She was the one that Edward asked about the traditional uniform that no longer existed. The air stewardess helped Edward up, and with a concerned look, she asked quietly, as the other passengers were all sound asleep, "Sir, what happened? Are you okay?" Edward was still in a slight state of shock and took a couple of breaths before replying, "Yeah, thank you. I'm okay." The air stewardess was still looking at Edward with a concerned look and asked, "What happened, sir? Did you slip and fall? Do you need any medical help? Edward then said, No, I'm fine. I guess I've figured out the mystery of your colleague in the traditional costume. Remembering the conversation they had earlier, the air stewardess then said, Oh, what do you mean by figured out, sir? Edward said, Yes, I saw her again, and I should have known. I let my curiosity get the best of me. I finally saw her face. Scared the crap out of me, and next thing I knew I was lying on the floor. The air stewardess seemed to have understood what Edward meant and said, Okay, sir. From my experience from the years of flying, there's one thing I learned. And what is that? Asked Edward. The air stewardess smiled and said, If we see anything out of the ordinary up here, we just keep it to ourselves. If we were to comment on anything that we see, it will just encourage these things to bother us even more. So, as much as possible, we just ignore it fully. Edward thanked the air stewardess for her help as he went back to his seat and tried to sleep. It took a while, as he was still tense from what had happened earlier. Every time someone would pass by his seat to head to the washroom, Edward would be startled and woken up. But eventually, Edward did get a night's sleep. It was a flight that Edward will never forget, as he would always remember the traditionally dressed air stewardess, whom Edward concluded was possibly a spirit that was engulfed in one of the many air crashes over the years. Or possibly it was just a lingering spirit who decided to toy with Edward. Who knows?